Can't hear me, make some kind of message, and I hope you can see me on Zoom. Welcome. Um, this is a sermon called The Untold Stories, um, probably because I believe we carry, as Americans, a subterranean both pride and sorrow over our country's wars, particularly our wars that end up being against Indigenous people. I would start with all the Indigenous tribes in our country and the very poor conditions under which most of them live, but manage to survive. I feel like there may be an unspoken despair how our country has carried out these wars in our country um, against tribes in Vietnam and indigenous peoples in Afghanistan and Gaza, our most current war. Um, these are also old cultures that could teach us must, very much, I think, in our high-tech lives. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family of veterans. I grew up in a big Catholic family that loved telling stories, yet our parents kept the hardest ones secret from us for most of our lives. And we didn't always tell them or even each other the worst things that had happened to us. We knew my father, Don, was drafted almost immediately after Pearl Harbor. My mother had joined the WACs in 1944. They were delighted to be in the service for one key reason. They both worked on family farms during the Depression, were not allowed to go to high school. They both were smart and loved learning, but in the service, they got their GED degrees and could study. There were bright, happy stories of my mother on Hamilton Air Force Base in California. She'd chosen that. They were able to kind of choose sometimes where they go. So she explored Hollywood, MGM. She got to ride the country's largest roller coaster. We loved that story as a child. And see the ocean, date officers. She was really good with numbers. She did payroll for 50,000 soldiers every month, counting out the cash by hand. There was a system of counting cash. One night, about 20 years ago, when I was home visiting and my mother and I were drinking highballs, she finally told me that her section officer, these were very powerful people, multiple stripes, I think he had 6 stripes, handsome, a lot of power, drove her off base and they were going to have a little date, but he raped her. And she had no recourse because even being reported off base meant her military career would have been ended. It took so many years for me to understand more about my mother from a story that she was maybe embarrassed and ashamed, but also afraid to tell me. Another untold story. My father, meanwhile, landed in Guadalcanal. This was a very strategic island in the Pacific. It was a place that the United States needed badly so that ships could land there, refuel, Marines, different officers, whatever they needed could get on those ships and head for Japan. So my dad told us stories that were kind of fun stories of like when he crept around a big jungle tree and he had his rifle ready and then somebody else was coming around the tree. This was very dramatic and he could see there was someone, but my dad got there first and shot the Jap, as he said. And so we felt how brave and strong my father was. They they didn't tell us about any of their struggles in the service. There were other stories about my father, who was extremely strong from all his farm work. He carried not only his own pack, but sometimes carried other soldiers' packs as well in Guadalcanal. This was a truer one. And when the morale was very low at Guadalcanal, after 2 years of heavy fighting, the soldiers would have an entire year and then have like a month in Australia, R&R, and then go back again to heavy fighting in foxholes. Um, then there was actually a raffle held because morale was so low. And my father was washing up at the river, and the word came that he'd won and he was going home. And this was the source of what was called in my family the door luck, because oddly, after that, My father often won at raffles, post office picnics. He worked at the post office or drawings at church, school. And so we felt we had this special luck. In fact, the real story was that he had survived malaria twice, so he was fairly strong to do that in his two terms in the Guadalcanal. He was sent to New Zealand and talked to us about that. He was on a farm for a month and he was just joyous being there, but had to go back to Guadalcanal. One of my brothers, who is now furloughed without pay after decades of working in the Air Force, researched some documents and said, you know, Sandy, I think it might have been that maybe it's possible that raffle was fixed because Dad was in pretty bad shape. There's indications that he really couldn't take any more heavy combat. And he wound up then, my father, at a base in Tennessee. He guarded German prisoners. Some were hardcore Nazis. But again, this is a story that rings very true that he told me. I had really good conversations with other Germans. They spoke English and they just like me, they just wanted to go home. As we grew older, our family grew, we moved to a bigger house. My sister and I, we had 7 children, really a nothing in our whole relatives. You know, I have 50 some first cousins. I have an aunt who had 12 children in 14 years. She was very proud of it, as you can imagine. So we moved to a bigger house. My sister and I get a bedroom, which is right next to my parents. And and we would start hearing things at night. My father would wake up after nightmares and still sob and cry over the war. My mother would be comforting him. I pitied and I loved my father, and I worried about him. In the closet of my sister and I in our bedroom, there was just never enough space for all these kids' closets. Somehow it was in our closet, there was a big box containing 3 rifles. And I was always afraid of those rifles. I had to close the closet door in order to go to sleep. I was worried that my father might go crazy. Would he go crazy? Would he get the rifles? Would he start shooting? Would he shoot us? I knew that there were things that he was really struggling with, but I didn't have any language for them. We came home from high school and Dad was gone. He's getting some help, my mother said. He'll be home in a couple of weeks, maybe. He'll be fine. My father spent a little over 2 months at St. Peter's Hospital, a story of what was called a nervous breakdown. That story was not told for years. Meanwhile, my brother Mike got a very low number, 25, in 1968 in the Vietnam lottery. He was immediately drafted. He looked pale and strange in his short hair and his stiff uniform in the very early morning when he left, hugging all 8 of us goodbye. For 2 years, he sent home buoyant letters. He was a big jokester. He could make anybody laugh. He signed them always, your hero and mine, making light of where he was at the northern tip of South Vietnam in an artillery unit, high on a hill that was shorn of all trees and growth because it had been completely sprayed with Agent Orange. That was the idea. You would protect the troops. Nobody could get up the hill. They would see them. But it was under attack in both Tet offensives in an area that has never been officially identified by the US Army. What hurt him was seeing across the border Vietnamese women and children bathing in the river. He also walked down the hill to the river where drugs and something called hooch, a wildly strong liquor, and desperate Vietnamese women were for sale. None of this was in his letters. I was, in those same months, writing home rapturous letters about California from the Los Angeles unwed mother's home I was in. Nothing about my own despair. A month after I returned home with my still happy stories of California, a taxi arrived in the front of, pulled up to our house in the middle of the night, and Mike was pounding on the front door. I woke up because that was also right under our bedroom and ran down. He was yelling, I'm home, open the door, open the damn door, I'm home, open the door. And we were all down in the living room, and he collapsed on the couch in my mother's arms and cried while she comforted him as she had my father. And we all cried together. And then my dad held him again. So my brother Mike just smoked like a lot of Vietnam veterans, a lot of dope when they got home. He tried college, he tried different jobs. Nothing was working. Only recently, I think probably within the last year and a half, he told me that it had truly taken him about 7 years to get back, really get back from Vietnam. He became, he moved to Chicago, married, divorced, remarried, has two wonderful sons. He became a highly successful insurance salesman because he loves telling stories. It makes people laugh and really liked getting people great policies. So he's been on oxygen for the last 2 years, severe lung disease from Agent Orange. We hope, we pray he's going to get some more time with us. And I'd like to give you a different poem. Also, this one was written World War II by Ezra Pound. It's a very long poem, his life's work called The Cantos. And this is just my favorite part of it, because I think the most amazing thing is for all of us, especially those who have loved and known veterans through this period, is that we're here. I mean, my husband, Gary, I met and had this life with him because he was also in the service. He was so bored by the work he was doing, even though he was 6'6" and a climber, incredible shape. So when he landed there, they made him head of his unit. And he was good at that, but he was so bored. At a certain point, he finally went into a hallway where there was a phone where you could call. I don't know who it was that you called, but he started talking and saying, I'd like to go to Vietnam. I can't stand it here anymore. And another man was walking down this long hallway, and he heard Gary and took the phone out of his hands, hung it up, and said, you don't want to go there. They're shooting officers. Our men are shooting their officers. So that's one reason I think it was a little miracle that Gary and I had those years and that Gary survived and went back home. Um, I was just thinking about one other little miracle, but basically it's it's those two miracles, my father's and Gary's. And so this long poem by Ezra Pound during and after World War II, one of the last stanzas was, what thou lovest well remains, the rest is dross. What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee. What thou lovest well is thy true heritage. We have two veterans who are going to come speak to us. Thank you. Lloyd will be first.
I thought that. Hi, Floyd Jeromo, 20-year member, 25-year member of this congregation. I wrote down some notes and I told Sandy, you want me to speak about my military career? Do you want 2 minutes or 3 days? I put some notes down and I can go for 2 minutes or 3 days. Okay, who's a veteran? What's a veteran? Why a veteran? I'm a veteran. How many veterans in here? Please stand up. Veterans? I want everybody in the congregation to see who's here. Thank you. Sandy's talk about her family. My religious or military career started with my father, who was born in 1896. He was a young man in southern Minnesota, and the youngest of 4 children was shipped to North Dakota to farm. The older boys stayed in Minnesota. Anyway, he got there, got pretty well established, World War I came along and he put it off, got put off, and finally got drafted into World War One. His whole career lasted, I think, about 4 months. He went through primary boot camp, and during that time, that all they did was bury about 10,000 people who had died of influenza, including the lieutenant commander of the base. He ended up going to New Jersey on a ship, getting ready to go to France, and the war ended. That was his career. Anyway, myself, uh, youngest one in my high school class, went to the University of Minnesota. 17 and a half, I joined the Navy, Naval Air, which actually was stationed at NAS Minneapolis, which is at Minneapolis St. Paul Airport. About my sophomore year, I decided to pursue a career in aviation. They said, 2 years of college, young man, you can be an airline or a naval aviator. So I signed up, went to Pensacola, and started to fly. Took us about 18 months to get through flight training. Uh, some of the people that I met en route, as a naval aviation cadet, which is very, very similar to Annapolis as far as the way you lived. Uh, one of the guys was, I'll talk about him a couple more minutes. Anyway, one was Jack Shrinker. He and I went through pre-flight, went into primary, and he had a trouble with flying formation and ended up being washed out. Went in as an enlisted person, put in his 2 years or whatever was required. Another one was Bob Flynn, who Bob and I were at the University of Minnesota together, and we did all of our testing and went into the program at the same time. Bob has an interesting history in that after 18 months of flight training, he was walked out of the program. However, he became an officer, bombardier navigator, unfortunately shot down in North Vietnam. His story didn't end there. He didn't end up in Hanoi. He ended up in China. He was kept a prisoner, unknown to all of us, for a long time. He ended up 5.5 years in solitary confinement in China. Got out. He made commander's rank and lived through the whole thing. Family, wife, pretty amazing story. Another one that I passed through in primary training with ended up with the instructor who was the commander of the squadron. And he had two students. I was one of them. The other one's name was John McCain. John went through all of flight training at the same time I did. Okay, out of the class 2858, which was our starting point in flight training, there were 60 of us, all 20 years old. I'd say 15 of the 60 didn't make it through flight training, so they went off to do other things. 15 died in airplane accidents. 15 probably stayed in the military, made it captain, most of them. One was actually headed to command of one of the nuclear carriers, but his wife had cancer and he ended his career for her. And probably 15, like myself, went to the airlines and flew. Anyway, all of those people, from airman apprentice to admirals, captains, are all veterans. And I thank you. That's my 5 minutes. 3 days.
I've titled these comments, Trying to Tell the Untellable, a transgenerational war story. He was the quiet one in my class, hollow-eyed and older than the rest, who on the last day softly asked if I was a veteran. Yes, I said. Vietnam, feeling the dread of what was to come. Pull me down to a dark place I thought I had locked away, but never really had, replaying the same memories over and over again, and always ending up sad. Me too. Iraq, he said. 2 tours, Mosul, 82nd Airborne. Then, bowing his head, tells me his story. And in his words, I hear my story again. The fear, the killing, the body count, the dust, the uncertainties, the mistakes, the lack of trust, the transformation of friend by day into enemy by night, eroding day after day the sense of right or wrong. How wrong? What was right? And how can I fight? How can I survive so morally compromised? You can't, I whispered with tears in my eyes. At some point you break, I said, remembering the moment. The guns, the gunships, the bombs, the fire raining down from the skies. Yes, and go numb, become completely unafraid, and be reborn as a killer, a wound in my soul that I cannot heal, he cried. The things I did, the things I saw, the war goes on in my head and never ends, he sobbed. The same moral demons, his and mine, rose up in his words and danced for a time as we embraced and cried together over what we had lost. Then we parted. Our stories barely started. And as I watched him go, my heart spoke what my mind couldn't say. You could be my son. No, our son. Not the eldest, but the youngest one, who served his country by taking, not saving, lives. Mostly innocent, mostly civilian, in a just war unjustified from the start. And what of our other sons and daughters too, who serve, who fight to make things right, trusting their leaders to think beyond black or white, to navigate wisely the complexity of grays, shaping and reshaping the ways we live, we love, we hate. In a world grown close, too close perhaps, but not too late, to search, to learn, to yearn for new ways to live beyond war, new ways to live in peace.
Our closing hymn today is hymn number 121, We'll Build a Land.